Okay, hello, and welcome to this eSchool News webinar, Cybersecurity in the K-12 Space, Realities and Myths. My name is Kevin Hogan. I am the editor-at-large for eSchool News, and I'm happy you are joining us today for what I know will be a very insightful and important conversation. This event is brought to you by United Data Technologies. UDT is a technology enabler that helps clients in major industries evaluate, architect, provide, secure, and manage technology on the go, in the rack, and in the cloud. UDT provides flexible and interoperable services, including mobility, cloud, collaboration, data, cybersecurity and software, and IT as a service. The company also provides technical, professional, and managed services. Before we get to our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to go over some of the features of the platform we're using here for this webinar. This event is being recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing a thing. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to this webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. If you have a question or a comment for Mike, there is a chat function that you can launch by clicking on chat. Feel free to use this feature also to contact someone from eSchool News team if you have a technical question. And I really do encourage folks out there, if you have a thought, a comment, a question, or even a concern, because it really does kind of help in terms of bringing out the best insights of what we're going to learn today. So with these housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with our conversation. And I had the pleasure to introduce Mike Sanchez. Mike is Chief Information Security Officer at UDT. And we just kind of gave you the description of what UDT is. But prior to UDT, he served as President and Chief Operations Officer for a Visa subsidiary, where he led the company's global cybersecurity initiatives for commercial and federal markets. I know Mike has had a long history concerning this topic, so I think we're really going to get a lot out of this coming hour. Mike, thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
So, before we get started, we actually want to ask the audience a question. Chris, if you could put up poll question number 1. We want to know what your biggest challenge is when it comes to cybersecurity. Is it finding and retaining qualified security specialists? Is it communicating cybersecurity issues to superintendents and or board members? Or number 3, how to prioritize activities? Of course, Mike, we probably should have the other option of all the above, right? I mean, these all seem to be points of pressure for folks in the space.
Absolutely. We can, and I can list 3 more, but
right. I'm sure it grows longer every day.
Absolutely.
So as we wait for those results to come in, maybe you can kind of look at those and see on your experience, is there one that's more important than the other?
Yeah, sure, definitely. Before I get into it, I want to give some color, because I want to make sure that the audience understands that I have a very unique understanding and experience dealing within the K-12 space, especially for cybersecurity and risk management, right? I mean, I'm not only the CISO for UDT, but I have the pleasure and honor of also serving as the CISO for Orange County Public Schools, Lee County, Indian River, and a number of other great institutions out there. And I know what they're all dealing with. I feel a team member of their organizations, right? And so I understand all the different challenges aside from, for instance, the recruiting of talent, the budgetary issues, some of the political hurdles that they have to jump through, right, in order to get some of these things implemented and installed in terms of technology or hiring resources. It's a real big issue for them. But aside from that, there's really 3 other challenges that I see that are really going to impact us going forward in this industry specifically, right? And that is the superintendents and the senior management and the school board members. There was a time when they didn't have a lot of experience when it came down to cybersecurity, right? And they viewed everything here as in this space. They focused a lot on technology, right? And technology really is not going to solve the issue here. right? Alone, right? Technology is great, and we've got great solutions out there in the industry that are helping to combat against attacks. Like, for instance, Microsoft has with the Microsoft Defender for endpoints, and their security solution suite is really providing great foundations to pick up attacks, right? But if those tools go out misconfigured or they're not tested correctly, they're not used to their most optimal level. So, I'm seeing more and more superintendents and boards and senior management pushing back and asking, why the increased request for investments? How do we justify the investments in new technologies? Are we optimizing the use of the technology that we have in place? So they're wondering, how well are we securing our assets? How do we stack up against our peers? What's really happening in the environment, right? Can what happened elsewhere happen here?
Right. I know that's especially a scary one, especially if it's a district next door, right? So it's like,
Absolutely.
what do we come next?
So
we did get the results that came in. And so, 1/3 of the audience says that communicating cybersecurity issues to superintendents and board members is the top priority. Although number one was about actually prioritizing all those activities. As I mentioned, the list grows longer every day. And I guess they want to try to figure out what to do first.
Right. Absolutely. 100%. So yeah, that is, so that highlights the point I just mentioned right now, right? How do you communicate these issues to the board that they understand? So, or senior management, some of these folks, they don't want to hear about red, green, or yellow lights. They want to understand, how is this going to impact? Am I at risk in being the victim of a ransomware attack? Are we ready for a ransomware attack? What else do we have to worry about? The pandemic, right? The pandemic, overnight, you had to go into a remote access environment, right? That shook up a lot of environments. A lot of people were not ready for it, and the attackers knew this. So again, making sure senior management is aware of the risks of what we're doing in terms of securing the environment, how we're progressing to a higher optimized level of maturity in the operations is an issue, right? And the other challenges that I see is obtaining cybersecurity insurance. So this is a challenge that is really hard on everyone. It's no longer a checklist item where you provide checklist form over to the insurance carrier, and they provide coverage for you. It's not that easy anymore, right? These guys now are asking for proof that you have different safeguards in place. They want to know if you've had an incident before. They want to see the type of reports that you have and you communicate with your senior management and what they're aware of, right? So you'll see them having more of an influence in the way that we manage and roll out an information security program as a whole. And then the other challenge that is getting tougher and tougher to deal with is the regulators. Dealing with the privacy regulators, such as the folks from the New York Department of Financial Services, NYDFS, or the CCPA out in California, or GDPR. You may have to check with your legal counsel, because just to make sure that that you have, if you don't have to comply with these privacy regulations, it's a good thing to have them considered, right? Because I think people are just tired of getting their identity stolen.
Right.
And I think the regulators are now catching up and saying, look, enough is enough. These are the things that we need to see in place, and you need to comply with these.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these issues that I've talked about for years and years and years. And one of the things in the education space that I always like covering is that usually you have the leaders in that space more than willing to talk to each other and share best practices. Sometimes when it comes to cybersecurity, not so much, especially if they've had a breach, right?
Oh, yeah.
Talk a little bit about the responsibilities of a district, if they do get hit. I mean, and I guess that comes into reporting it to your insurance folks, obviously, but when you talk about the regulators, talk about some of those realities.
So yeah, look, you just hit a great point there. Sometimes in the past or historically, breaches, understandably haven't been reported correctly, right? People shy away from reporting these breaches for one reason or another, right? But it is the responsibility of any organization, whether it's in the education space or any other industry. Every state has a different statute when it comes to data breach notifications. Now, I just mentioned an important topic there, said word called breach, and everybody loves to throw around the word breach. When you say breach to me, the hairs in the back of my neck, they instantly go up, right? Because breach means something's been compromised, data's been extracted, the house is on fire, let's put it out quickly, right? And that's different than from a security incident, right? And a security incident is something you need to follow up on, but it could be a false positive, right? When you say confirmed breach, that brings the whole event up to a different level. And there you need to, if you have proof that there's data being extracted out of the organization, which constitutes personal identifiable information, or it could be something related to healthcare as well, right? PHI. Then you are mandated. I recommend that everybody get familiar with their state statutes regarding these data breach notification laws. And then you also have to make sure that you comply with federal ones as well, right? But there are time frames that you need to comply with once you've confirmed that you have a data breach in place, right? So very important. And that should also be included in your incident response plan, right? All those notification rules and what triggers that notification and to whom should be in that playbook.
So let's go back to the original poll question here for a second, where half the audience is concerned about how to prioritize their activities. Maybe talk a little bit about do you have a checklist? Do you have a
yeah.
What is that on a day-to-day? What's at the top of the list, and how do you move it down?
Yeah. So listen, at the top of the list is always understanding where the threats are coming from. Okay, because a lot of people tend to have controls in place and try to protect against everything. You can't that's just impossible to do, right? You'll end up not doing anything. So the way that I typically prioritize all my efforts is based on, number one, how much risk is the organization willing to take? Number one, right? And I make sure that everyone understands how much risk we're willing to take in this organization, because that's going to drive how I protect the environment. What type of controls I put in place and how stringent they are. Right? Cybersecurity efforts in risk management and cybersecurity, you got to balance them out, right? Because you don't want to make them too hard, too difficult to do business with, right? So I take a look at, we understand what our risk appetite is, especially at UDT and for some of the school districts that I lead their efforts for in terms of the information security program. We understand what that risk appetite is, number one. The second thing is, what do I need to worry about in terms of attack vectors and threats? Where are they coming from? What are the things that are going to occupy all my efforts, right? And making sure that I protect all the assets against. And that in this industry, the K-12 industry specifically, there are four attack vectors or threat vectors that we see most often, right? Number one is web application hacking, where there's a lot of in the school districts, there's development of internal applications that are externally facing. In other words, people can access those external facing applications through the internet, right? And some of those applications, unfortunately, haven't been developed with security controls in place, and they've never been tested. So they've never had a pen test on one of those applications. One thing that we see sometimes is, for instance, an in-house developed application sitting on top of a, like, for instance, an ERP platform like a PeopleSoft. Folks don't test that, and you should. So we see breaches or, and security incidences a lot coming from web application penetration tests. We also see a lot of delivery being made through email phishing and now vishing as well with a V. Okay, so these things are easy to send out, and it's a numbers game, right? These folks, these attackers, they know that they send out these thousands of emails in bulks, and these emails may contain malicious code, or they may contain a malicious payload, or they may just want to have get credentials from your folks, right? And so we see email phishing attacks all the time. But now, like I said before, because of breaches that originated from, for instance, the social sites like LinkedIn, Yahoo, those breaches that occurred in the past, that data that they included phone numbers. So now you're seeing a lot of phishing text messages on your phone. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to see if your phone number is really a legitimate working number, so they can follow up. If you respond to that text message, they may follow up with a malicious link for you to hit, to access, trying to steal your credentials. Or they might be trying to do something what we call CEO fraud, where they're attempting to say, hey, the text message might come or might appear as it's coming from your CEO, and he's asking you to transfer funds to a vendor. And if you take a look at the phone number, it appears to be coming from the person that's your CEO. And some people, unfortunately, fall for this trap. The other attack vector that is most prevalent in our space is exploits of misconfiguration of assets or channels or protocols. And one of those is, for instance, remote desktop services. Right? When COVID hit and everybody went to a remote environment, remote learning environment, there was a lot of misconfiguration errors in terms of communication protocols, accessing different devices. So we see a lot of those attacks being successful because of these exploits on those configurations.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, well, obviously the technologies are sophisticated on the black hat side, but the technologies are sophisticated on the defensive side, but it still ends up being a human condition, right? That kind of triggers these things. Talk a little bit about for our audience here. I mean, it's like how much of their job should be about educating users versus making sure the algorithms are in place.
Educating users, not only users, but for instance, folks that are in specific security roles, and also executive leadership, right? Typically, what I see most often is an organization will do an email phishing campaign, right, to try to test the awareness of their employees or contractors. And they might do this maybe once a year or twice a year at most. That's something that we religiously here at UDT, for instance, and in most of the places that we serve as a CISO in those organizations, we take a very aggressive view of testing our employees, no matter what. Even our CEO, we will test him every day, every night, doesn't matter. We want to make sure that he's aware because he might be target number one.
Right.
Right. So making sure that these things are done on a monthly basis. If your results of an email phishing campaign tells you that 20% of your audience, of your target base, right, has clicked on a link, and they then went off, maybe 50% of the 20%, right, went on and provided credentials because they got duped into providing their credentials, you got a problem. Your training and awareness program is not that great. Right. So how do you mitigate against that? You mitigate it by retesting, and making sure that you focus on the problem areas. When I say problem areas, I'm talking about let's test departments so we can identify if there's a weakness in one specific area. Maybe it's the executive group, maybe it's the finance group. But so you do these testing more than once, right? Until those numbers drop below the national averages are about a 4%, between 2 and 4%. What does that mean? That means that on any given test day, you will have 2 to 4% of your audience will fail an email phishing campaign test. It's just it's
law of
pretty
numbers.
baseline. It's the law of numbers. About 2 to 4%. You have to account for that 2 to 4%, and then you have to take a look at how many repeat offenders do I have in this population, because you have to really step up what you do there. What's the follow-up? More training? Is there a disciplinary action? We have some clients that take really stringent disciplinary actions on your second strike, right? They put you on probation. On your third strike, you're out.
Wow.
Just because of the impact that some of those things have, right? On your operations. So yeah, the training and awareness is super important.
Can you talk a little bit about kind of time frames? I mean, I think one thing that's always kind of cloudy when you talk about a ransomware attack or a phishing attempt, and I get the impression, a lot of times it's like this immediate, so you talk about a breach and then immediately everything goes haywire, but that's not necessarily the case, right? I mean, give us some examples of how long something might take before you even understand that you've been hit.
Yeah, so that's a great point. Most attacks, they might happen in minutes or seconds, but being able to detect that attack takes longer. In most cases, it takes about 167 days on average to detect those attacks, right? And there's been cases, about 7% of cases, depending on what threat intelligence survey you look at, about 7% of attacks are sitting in your environment for more than a year. So they have all this time frame to do reconnaissance, and that's what they want to do, right? They want to find out how they can move laterally, right? Move from asset to asset, kind of find out what you have where, right? What kind of data is sitting in what servers and what assets, and they will set up something called the command and control in the back at the same time, which is a backdoor, right? It's and that's how they gain more and more intelligence into your environment, right? And so it's critically important that you have these detection, that you're always testing your detection rules with all these solutions that you have in place, right? You might have a SIM in place. You might have even the firewalls, right? And the intrusion prevention, intrusion detection systems. All those rules and policies, you'd be surprised, Kevin, how many times people or folks just don't conduct a security configuration review of these components, or how many times they don't do a penetration test that focuses on specific attack vectors. So in order to test if your detection rules are firing or not, right? And sometimes these detection rules, sometimes they don't get configured correctly. And then what ends up happening is your folks run after false positives. And that's you waste a lot of time chasing false positives in this industry, right? So yeah, detections are usually not done instantaneously. I mean, there are great solutions out there, for sure, but they're only as good as you test them and configure them.
Right? So you really have to have an attitude of, you're always on alert. Almost like an air traffic control sort of sensibility, but then at the same time, you have to have a long-term thought about the security strategies that you have.
Yeah, look, that poll shows me 53%, right, are worried about prioritizing their efforts. believe it or not, when I first got into this business, that was what consumed me every day. Why? Because there's so much noise coming at you from all kind of different directions. You're getting noise alerts from technology. You're getting, you're worried about what kind of connections you're giving your third-party vendors. You're worried about whether you terminated access for employees that are no longer with you, right? And so I learned very quickly that I needed to consolidate and unify all of this information, all of this noise into something that would give me some type of sense of importance, right? What matters the most to me today, right? And I did, the only way that I could do that was to measure everything that is important in the environment that we should be looking at, right? The key performance indicators, such as how many users do I have out there? How many users, idle users that I have in the environment? How many, what's that threshold based on my risk appetite? How many of those users am I going to allow to be admins in my environment? Right? How many of these users am I taking off, the AD access once they leave the company? What's my time to detect an attack? Right? What's the host that has the most vulnerabilities, and how long is it taking to fix these vulnerabilities, right? So these KPIs and KRIs, I look at them very closely. My CEO looks at them very closely. I mean, I think my CEO is probably the hardest guy I got to deal with from all the rest of the CISO clients that I have. I tell you, he's got to be the hardest. Why? Because we always say we want to eat our own lunch. Right. Here at UDT. Right. And so making sure that I prioritize efforts surrounding the stuff that impacts us the most, right, is our focus.
And one thing that comes to mind here, as we look at that, prioritizing activities, we're pretty well into our conversation here, and we still haven't talked about students. We're talking about administration. We're talking about faculty members, as being the breaks. Where does student usage fall in terms of those priorities? I mean, are they
at the highest level?
They're the highest. They're number one.
I have a real passion for this, for the K-12 space. Why? Because it impacts the most innocent, right? If you think about, the type of data these knuckleheads, as I call them, are trying to get to, they're trying to get to personal information, right? That can impact the future of all those kids in the school systems. And so we're very, very aggressive in terms of how we try to help our school districts, and in the way that they secure their environment, making sure that we focus on the data that matters the most, and making sure that the controls are there, the safeguards are there, to make sure that that information is not easily accessible. Yeah. Because we know the impact if it does, get into the wrong hands. Yeah. So we're really passionate about making sure that, we don't miss a step in terms of securing the environment there. Now, on the other hand, there are some folks, or there are some, the students themselves are pretty clever, and they're always trying to test you, right? And I tell you, some of these guys, I want to hire them myself, because they're pretty sharp, right? So you always got to also consider what kind of safeguards do I need to put in place to prevent us from the misuse of data from internal attacks, internal threats.
That's right. Where it kind of dates myself here, but brings back to that movie War Games, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
the kid came in and hit it there.
Yeah, they're pretty sharp, I tell you.
Yeah. So that's a good segue, actually, to go into now that we've kind of discussed the challenges, and maybe we start talking about some of the strategies and some of the solutions. So, Chris, if you could pull up the other poll question we have for the audience to see where they are. So for the audience, what's more important when it comes to protecting your environment? And we're going to ask you to just pick one. Running vulnerability scans periodically, performing a network penetration test once a year, or conducting monthly email phishing assessments. Now, Mike, you've already kind of discussed each one of those, already as something that needs to be consistent and consistent and frequent, right?
You just said the most important term there. It's got to be consistent. Whatever you're doing, in terms of hardening the environment, resiliency is my number one thing, right? Resiliency. How do you make the environment harder once you implement it, and then you continue doing the right best practices to make sure that components there trying to safeguard your assets are remain resilient against the most prevalent attack vectors.
Yeah.
Right? So that's again, we talk about the how do I prioritize efforts, and again, I understand what the threats are, and then I take a look at what those threats, how they're impacting our mission critical assets, which is, listen, it's really important you understand, you identify what's mission critical in your environment. And I know that's a big effort. It's a big challenge, but you got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
You've got to start somewhere, and you can, there's always databases with data in it that you need to safeguard. So what are those threats that are going to hit, let's say, an Active Directory server? What am I dealing against here? So it's super important that you stay focused and prioritized when it comes to putting in the safeguards or applying mitigation strategies in the environment. And I want really
so
interested
results
to
came
see
back from the second poll question. 67% conduct monthly email phishing assessments,
I love that.
And 33% run vulnerability scans periodically, but nobody said they're performing a network penetration test once a year. What
really
what surprising?
Really surprising, right? Because so the penetration test, talk about trying, a penetration test is going to give you a lot more idea of where you're standing in terms of exploitable vulnerabilities. Right? Vulnerability scans are great, and it's part of the vulnerability management practice, right? Which is combined with patches, making sure that that you're doing your patches, but taking it that extra step and trying to match up. Let's say the way we do things here at UDT and the way we do it for our customers is we conduct penetration tests that based on real world attack vectors, and we map everything that we do to frameworks like the MITRE attack framework, right? So we can justify and kind of logically go through the sequence of where we identify holes and where we can make them better. And plus, we also augment it with things that we've seen ourselves. I mean, we've been at this for at least 15 years. And so we have a lot of data, a lot of historical trends. And so penetration tests, I'm really surprised that it came up with a 0% in the poll.
Well, is that something that you need to have a kind of security consultant or advisor to help you run, or is that something that's embedded in with particular cybersecurity network systems? I mean, is that something that is it them just pressing a button, or do you need to have more advanced sort of consultation?
Look, in this business, there's never an easy button. Right, because you always have to go shift through the data and find out and understand, if something is a false positive, or if something, you might have a solution that it does a penetration test for you, but that solution is not going to be able to tell you what the probability of you suffering that attack will be, and that's where the rubber meets the road. Right, in this environment, and in our ability to tell the story, Mr. Customer, oh my God, we found a critical vulnerability inside your organization. However, you got to jump through hoops, right? And the probability of you suffering that attack might be less than 3%. So do you focus on that, or do you focus on something else?
Right.
So yeah, as much as everybody wants a fully automated way of testing the environment, it's a little bit more difficult than that, because Attackers don't have easy solutions like that either. Attackers are in there manually doing things and using or going after the path of least resistance, right? And they're not using automated tools to test your environment. I can tell you that much. They're just not doing it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a human ingenuity, whether it's for good or for evil, right?
Yeah. And sorry to interrupt, but I just
Sure.
it reminded me of something else, right? So, penetration test is just one thing, right? One tool or one assessment you can conduct, and you have all these tools in place that now provide you similar capabilities, vulnerability assessments, penetration tests, you name it, right? But at the end of the day, as a CISO, right, if you are in charge of an information security program for an organization, you've got to pull all this data from all of these tests that you're running. And again, it comes down to, what do I do first, Mike? Right? So if you don't standardize the way that you do that testing, spitting out a report is not going to help you. And it's not going to help you when you're sitting in front of the superintendent and the board. Because what are you going to do? You're going to pull out 15 different reports and talk to them about the 15 different findings?
Right.
You're going to lose them on that first, once you open your mouth.
Yep.
Yeah.
It goes back to the communications bit from the
Absolutely
question that everybody talked about.
Got to tell the story.
Now, one question that came to me during the course of our conversation here is, and you look at these answers from the audience, and I know that we have a scale of size of district, right? I mean, you look at what occurred at Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, and maybe there's somebody at a smaller district who's like, well, thank goodness I don't have to worry about that kind of stuff, because they're only going to hit the big districts or small districts. Is this something across the board that needs to be concerned, or are there certain threats and challenges to smaller districts that bigger districts don't have? Or kind of give us a sense of this going across the scale of size of districts.
So most attacks are not targeted. Okay. The smaller districts have more to fear than the larger districts. Why? Because attackers are looking for the path of least resistance. If you're making it that much harder for me to try to gain access into your environment, right, I'm going to go to the next guy and I'm going to try to test them out, and I'm going to see how much I can gain there. But if you make it really hard for me to gain access, or to extract data from your environment, I'm just not going to stay there. I need to move on. I need to see where else I can what other platforms I can exploit. So in this industry across the board, the 5 or the 4 major attack vectors or threat vectors that I spoke about before hit everyone: small, mid, large. And if you take a look at historically, in the past 2021, we saw ransomware attacks increase by 30% from the year before. That is an increase that's greater than 5 years, or a combined 5 years of keeping track of ransomware activities and their growth, right? So what does that tell you? Ransomware is here to stay. It's just becoming more prevalent, right? And so, the ransomware is attacking everyone, and it's the folks with the least amount of controls in place, least amount of safeguards in place, protections, that these attackers love, because they can always pivot from there. It's a numbers game.
Right.
It's a numbers game.
What advice do you give to the audience who, are running districts? I mean, maybe they have a baseline. Well, I mean, let's assume everyone has a baseline of security efforts, or what they think are security efforts. Maybe it's, features that are baked into their various learning management systems, or, web-based systems. And those particular vendors are saying, well, yeah, and we'll keep you secure. You're in your walled garden. And that's giving folks a false sense of security. What would your advice be to take their strategies to that next level that they need?
Yeah, so look, it's very important to understand what things you're measuring, because I see a lack of focus on measuring things that tells you where to focus your efforts on, right? So one of the things that is so simple, and people will probably say, Mike, you're talking about the obvious terms, but yeah, like I said to you before, Kevin, it might be obvious, but it's still ongoing. I see it everywhere exploited, and that is the use of passwords, right? So credential management, access management is one of the leading efforts that you can put in place today to try to minimize your attack or your exposure levels. If your passwords are less than 8 characters long and you're not managing that password, and you're allowing for users to have blank passwords, or they're not being prompted to change passwords, you're in trouble if you're not using any type of other authentication mechanism, right? So why don't allow people, this is silly to say, but one of the first things that we exploit when we do our penetration tests for clients and even ourselves is we're always looking for users that have easily breakable passwords, right? Something that's very easy to break, because we have libraries of terms that we use, and we can and sometimes crack things in seconds, and definitely in less than 10 minutes. I can tell you that much. And sometimes we see folks that have employees that they can use similar or simple passwords, like let's say spring 2022. You'd be surprised how many people have that same password string, right, in there as part of their credentials. And we exploit that all the time.
Yeah.
And so making sure that you have good credential policies in place, having multi-factor authentication. And I know in this industry, in our space, in the K-12 space, sometimes it's very hard to roll out MFA, multi-factor authentication, right? Even though they might be paying for the technology, but there might be some type of issue that prevents us from rolling out MFA to everyone, multi-factor authentication. If that's the case, I would say, look, your passwords then have to be doubly strong, right? It has to be at least 14 characters long. And listen, we implemented that here at UDT, but people understood that we want to make sure we eat our own lunch, right?
Yeah.
And
but you really hit on an important part there. I mean, just in a big picture, when it comes to the use of technologies in the classroom and the use of technologies from an instructional standpoint, especially when you mentioned the pandemic and going remote. There's one thing about UDT executives doing multi-factor authentication, and then there's the third grade student who's trying to get to their
right.
home in Google Docs, or their parents. And what's the balance there? Where is that balance to where the security isn't interrupting?
Yeah, absolutely.
Technologies.
Yeah, 100%. Great question, right? Because we have to deal with that all the time. So if you can't roll out multi-factor authentication, there are things in place that allow you to authenticate to maybe the device, or maybe to the IP of the user. So less intrusive things than installing an MFA that a sixth grader might have, or a fifth grader might have an issue with, right? Or a third grader. I'm not going to say sixth graders. Sixth graders they're well advanced, but
they're probably hacking in at that point.
Yeah, exactly. So somebody like a first grader trying to, we understand that they can't have MFA on their devices, but there's other things that we can put in place to authenticate against those devices, right? And so yeah, we deal with that all the time. Mike, like for instance, and I. As a CISO, I have to walk a very fine line. So I'm not out there trying to promote products and solutions. But sure. I can tell you that, for instance, Microsoft has a great way of trying to authenticate or provide authentication solutions or options outside of MFA, right? It's got conditional access. It has a great, gives you a couple of different options there to authenticate users. So there are options in there, but it all goes back to at the very foundational level. Having strong passwords, you got to put that in place. I mean, seriously,
Yeah, that sounds like that's the route. Well, you mentioned tools, and in our conversations, before this conversation, we were talking about some of the other challenges or issues, and one of which was that there may be too many security tools that are misused. Talk a little bit about kind of proper management, and I guess that kind of goes back to where I was saying too. It's like you have other products that are and platforms that you're managing on your systems, who each vouch that they have their own security in place, but maybe they're just not being used in the right way.
Yeah, that's everywhere I go. I mean, so people spend a lot of money in buying tool sets and applications. Firewalls, for instance, right? Firewalls are great. They can shield a lot of things away from your environment. But if you're not checking the rule sets, every quarter, once a quarter, making sure that the configs, they're not, or that asset doesn't have some kind of vulnerability announced by the vendor, right? Then it's not being effective. If there's a feature within these firewalls that they're basically tied to geographical locations, and it blocks the incoming and outgoing traffic. If you're not reviewing those against, for instance, the OFAC country list of censored countries, then that firewall is not operating at its optimal level. Okay, SIMs are great, right? They're a great tool to have in place, but again, you're going to get flooded with a lot of alerts, and we have something in the industry called alert fatigue. The more alerts you get, right, it makes it harder for your staff, your employees, your IT department to follow up on, hey, I'm being asked to chase all of these events. Which one do I take care of first? How do I know if the one that's classified as a critical is really a critical, or just maybe it's not classified correctly, right? So things like logs and not being turned on. If something happens in your environment, and for instance, we have our own incident response team in-house. We've done up to date 45, I would say major investigations with an average host base of about 50,000 hosts, right? These things are very stressful, but the one thing that we see across the board sometimes, or a majority of times, is people don't have their logs enabled. If you don't have your logs enabled, it's going to make it really hard for us to pinpoint what really took place in your environment. So, a SIM is great to have in terms of collecting that log, but have in mind, how do you retain it? For how long do I have to retain it, right? There's regulatory issues or regulatory acts out there that tells people how long they need to keep these logs for. Right? You just can't just overwrite those logs every other week, because that's going to make it really hard for us to try to help you out in identifying what really took place during an incident, and how to fix it and how to mitigate it from happening again.
So here's a takeaway that I'm feeling as a result of this conversation here, and going back again to poll question number 1 about prioritizing activities. Maybe activity number 1 would be to assess and audit your current security situation and your current condition, and maybe turn on some of these logs that you might not be using right now. Give the audience some advice in terms of that. Go a little deeper what you're saying in terms of turning on the logs.
Look, so I always pause when I get asked this question, because I look at it from 2 different angles. What are the things that I can do today that are either tactical or based on governance, right? And I always struggle with that, because, and not struggle, but I always pause and think to myself, okay, Mike, you can always tell people, look, understand where your assets are, right? Because if you don't understand where your assets are, you can't protect them. But tactically, what can you do to reduce your attack vector, right? So what, I mean, you need to be able to understand where your mission critical systems are at a minimum. What are those that I need to be protecting against? And what are the threats that are going to impact those systems? That doesn't take a lot of effort in terms of understanding what your threats are. There's a ton of threat intelligence reports out there that kind of give you guidance in what's happening across the board, but I already gave them to you. Right, I already gave them to you. Web app attacks, the email phishing, right? Remote desktop exploits or misconfiguration of devices. And then you have the last one we didn't touch upon real quick was DDoS attacks, right? Being able to bring down your system. Those are the 4 things that keep me up at night. The DDoS attacks, just, you know, I can go down a rabbit hole here, but in terms of DDoS attacks, to me, are red herrings, because DDoS attacks not only bring your systems down and they prevent you from operating daily, but they're meant for a purpose, and that purpose is to restart your systems. And you remember what I mentioned earlier, that you could have something in place in your environment that could be sitting there for the past, I don't know, 167 days, maybe a year, and you don't know about it, and all of a sudden now, you know, your DDoS restart triggers some kind of malicious payload that it was waiting for to trigger, right? So always got to be mindful of that. But if, again, one of the tangible things that you can do today, forget about the governance stuff for right now, but the tactical stuff, check your Active Directory configurations, because that is one of the things that these guys love to target and hit the most, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. Do a resiliency, right, evaluation of that platform, right? Know how many groups they're in, how many objects you have there, how many idle users you have in your environment, how many non-unique passwords are in there. Try to see if, and you know, we have this assessment called the indicators of compromise, where we go in there and we try to do a compromise assessment and identify if there's something in the environment that's been with you for a long time, but you don't know about. And so one of the things that we look at within the AD environment itself, that's, for us, it's really, really important. Understand, number 2, your incident response plan. Test it immediately, right? Some people just have it in the shelf. You know, it's collecting dust, but that's probably the most important document you can have to try to, because, you know, I call these things a freak out moment. I get called into these situations, everybody's hair is on fire, right? You gotta settle them down. And when I ask for, you know, the playbook, the incident response plan, nobody has it, or it's outdated, hasn't been modified. So do an incident response plan, a real simple tabletop exercise, and try to go and include your executives and everybody that should be involved in that incident response team, right? Make them part of that incident response tabletop exercise, so you can flush out if what you have in your incident response plan is really the way it's going to work if you get hit with a ransomware attack. The third thing I would do, again, I'm going back to my threats, the tangible things that I can do today. I want to be able to say there are specific safeguards, right, that help you harden your email platform, right? And I would take a look at that. So you're either it's Office 365 or whether it's Google, take a look at, you know, what kind of rules are in place there. Are there any forwarding rules that are going out into the environment that you weren't aware of, right? Or especially to external host, what's that doing there, right? And so taking a look at the configuration settings of your Office 365, your email platform, whatever it be, is super important, super critical, and that you do it at least twice a year, for God's sakes. Because I'm telling you, I'm giving you little secrets that I see that we do from our internal standpoint. When we try to hack and we do our own penetration tests, we're looking for all these tool sets, and we're looking to see what we can exploit. An email channel is a great channel for me to spread information, extract information, share information, right? So take a look at that component. Right, that's really, really important. Also take a look at again, I'm going back to what are the things you can do today that doesn't really require a lot of effort, right? It just takes some time.
Right.
And if you don't have the knowledge, there's people that can help. But teams or your environment that you share documents with, right? Why are you allowing documents to flow out of your environment within a Teams meeting, right, to an external party?
Yeah, I mean, it's just Swiss cheese, right? I mean, it's just
if you have an external party participating in your meeting and you're allowed to send them a document through Teams, there's something wrong with your data security policies.
Right.
Right.
And I'm sure a lot of those policies went out the window during the pandemic too, just in an effort to get people connected and just kind of get it together. I know a lot of acceptable use policies were put on shelves and maybe they haven't been brought back out again now that we're back to whatever our normal is.
I hope people are writing this stuff down, because I just gave you guys some really top tips. And the other thing that I see that is, tangible things you can do right now when you hang up this phone and go back into your workplace is backups. Who's validating your backups? Right. And I would be asking, if I were a superintendent out there or somebody that writes the check, I would be asking, hey, when was the last time we did our backups? Who's hosting our backups? Has there been any jobs that failed in our backups procedures? Have they been rerun, or are we still having the same technical issues? Right. Super important, because if a ransomware attack hits and you have no backups, it's going to be a bad day.
Right.
Super. Right. And I can go on forever, but I think I just gave you guys, and of course, phishing, the training and awareness every month.
Yeah. Right. Well, I knew the toughest part of my job this afternoon would be to end the conversation, because there's so much. We said we didn't even get to the governance. I guess our audience can worry about the governance on the weekends, right?
Well, I mean, I worry about the governance. I worry about the governance all the time, because without process and procedures, right? Imagine if we wanted to go to the moon and they had no when we went to the moon, we had no process or procedures in place telling us what to do. Then we have an ad hoc environment. It's going to be a mess.
Right.
So yeah, governance is always at the top of my at the top of my strategy in terms of the information security program. But I know that people want to do tangible things today. Right. And I just gave them what are the easiest things, or the not so hard things that doesn't require that investment today, that you can confirm whether you have or not.
100%. Well, Mike, I'd like to thank you for a really informative presentation. I think when we send the link out in a couple of days, that people can go back over it again and even make a transcript of it. There's just some line by line points of what folks can do in order to kind of take an accounting of their current situation and then take steps to increase the security. So thanks for your time today with that.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you again for hosting this. And if there are folks out there, and look, this is a topic that is there's a lot of information, but trust me, we have a very structured approach in the way that we manage our efforts in terms of information security program. We take it really seriously, and we love to help.
That's great. And I'd also like to thank the audience members for joining in as well. I mean, it was great to have the results that came from the poll questions, and a few that came in to help with the conversation. So as a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to the recording along with the slides. Thanks again for participating, and have a great day.